Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, and this is episode 63. Today, we have a special guest and a friend of mine, Caleb Weiss. He's a senior analyst at the Bridgeway Foundation and a longtime contributor to the Long War Journal. Welcome again, Caleb, to Generation Jihad, and thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, thank you for having me again. I always love coming back here to talk, whatever the issue of the day is, especially, African jihad. So let's do it.
It's fantastic. And Caleb, your ability to track what's happening in Africa and then in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and Syria, it's incredible. I know you focus on Africa, but I know I can rely on you and so much more. You just follow this in a way that is quite impressive. So thanks again for your hard work. Absolutely.
I like to call it my, special nerd ability of, just countless hours on Twitter, terminally online.
Ooh. I'm getting a little older and I'm trying to get away from that. And I feel a little less nerdy, but boy, when I, talking to other people, you still realize what a nerd you are once you get back to work. So today we're going to discuss the recent events related to the jihad in Africa. This theater has been, if you excuse the pun, exploding for the past decade. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have made significant inroads in Africa, particularly in the Sahel, sub-Saharan Africa, even in Central Africa. But today we're going to look at Mali. We're going to look at Mali and separate Somalia, Benin. We have a lot of current news going on that we're going to do a quick sweep of. And Caleb, I thought no one was better to do this than Caleb. So we woke up this morning to the news that the Malian government has ordered French-led troops to leave the country immediately. Yesterday, France announced that it was indeed leaving Mali. Caleb, exactly what's happening here? Give us the background story on the situation in Mali that has led to this very strange set of circumstances that is going to see France abandon its mission in Mali.
Yeah, I would say, most listeners are probably familiar with, French military activity in Mali since 2012, early 2013, when they intervened in Mali to stymie, an Al-Qaeda-led advance across, most of northern Mali and into central Mali. And really since then, they've been trying to, destroy that insurgency, or trying at least. It's not been really successful. It's kind of just pushed insurgents elsewhere. But the current issues really started happening, I would say, 2 years ago, following a coup in August 2020 that removed Mali's, longtime president IBK, or Ibrahim Boubacar Keita. That was, he was overthrown by a military-led junta that, nominally established a civilian-led government for a while, but that only lasted until, May 2021, when there was another coup that was led by some of the same people who did the previous coup in August 2020. And since May 2021, I know this is confusing. Your face is making it seem like this is confusing.
No, Caleb, I'm going to be honest here. I just can't get the Simpsons bit of a bloodless coup out of my head. That's why you see my face. I'm trying not to laugh, and I just can't get that out of my head when you say coup.
But anyway, that's it. You had a coup in August 2020, and then another coup in 2021, led by some of the same people. So a coup within a coup. And since May 2021, Mali's been ran by a military junta, especially led by one guy, Assimi Goïta. He's sort of like the president, if you will, of Mali. It's really since his reign that the relationship with France has kind of taken a huge downward spiral. The brief overview is that France accuses Goïta and his, ruling coalition of not abiding by some of their promises, especially, paying people, returning to civilian-led government, corruption, stuff like that. At the same time, Goïta and his ruling coalition is accusing France of not abiding by, military agreements they signed, France not doing enough to stymie the jihadist insurgency, not doing enough to support them. And then especially late or mid last year, when France unilaterally announced that, they're going to pull back some troops from northern Mali, that really upset the military junta. They accused France of not consulting them on this, and really that's what's happening here. This is the backbone of the current crisis: is that you have a lot of back and forth between the military junta and France accusing each other of not doing enough or not doing something that's resulted in this. So now you have Mali telling France to formally leave the country, not only France, but also their Task Force Takuba, which Task Force Takuba was this, or is this, military coalition with France as kind of the nucleus, but it's European countries that operate throughout the Sahel, especially in northern Mali, that Mali is also requesting they leave. So it's a whole mess based around these two coups that happened over the last 2 years.
Yeah, these unstable countries. This really fuels throws fuel on the fire because the jihadist groups, they thrive in this type of environment. The more
absolutely,
it's amazing. So today you had the president of Niger, Mohamed Bazoum. He announced that he was going to host those French troops that were going to leave Mali. Is this a positive? Is this a negative? And who can fill the void, if anyone? That void of the French-led force inside of Mali?
I don't really know if this is a positive or negative. This is kind of like, we had this discussion earlier that Barkhane, the overall French operation across the Sahel, has kind of been a mixed bag of, you've had some pros, top leadership of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have been killed. There's been some degradation of violence in northern Mali. France has supported some formal government structures in the north, but mainly military structures, such as like joint patrols against various different former rebel groups. But there's a lot of cons to Barkhane that I think, need to be stressed here. Of, even though they have killed a lot of, top jihadist leaders, you've said numerous times, you and Tom have both said numerous times that, leadership decapitations don't always work. I mean, these are organizations that are built to withstand leadership loss. The dispersion of violence, even though that France has, made northern Mali relatively safer, it's just pushed the jihadists elsewhere into central Mali, into Burkina Faso, into Niger and elsewhere. You also had France, outsourcing a lot of their missions and operations to communal militias. There was a few pro-government Tuareg militias in the north that France used to rely on that, would do their own fair share of violence against civilians that only made, France's legitimacy worse. These are all going into, the overall analysis of Barkhane that really it's kind of a mixed bag. So the fact that it's leaving, really the question is like, what happens now? And I don't know. And I don't think most people do know. It's going to be a test of whether or not Mali can truly withstand everything that's happening to them without France, without these European support. But, important to note that, like, even though France and their European partners in Takuba have said that they'll leave Mali, they're not necessarily leaving the region. As we stated, Niger has said that they'll host them. France has already had troops in Niger for a long time. There's a base in Niamey, the capital. France also has bases in Senegal, Ivory Coast, and Gabon, I believe. So there are other areas where they can potentially host troops. And France has said that they'll focus more on Burkina Faso, Niger, and like the Gulf of Guinea states. So that's Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, where jihadis are now pushing into. So really, it's just the future is up in the air. I don't know what's gonna happen. It's all going to depend on how well Mali can handle things without France. I don't think France necessarily, is going to lose out on a lot. There's still a lot up in the air that we don't know about future Mali operations. Like, does this preclude France from doing any sort of surgical strike or limited operation in Mali? How does this affect France's relationship with, MINUSMA in Mali, the UN peacekeeping force there? Just all of these variables that go into this that, simply it's very unclear at this stage, but basically a recipe for disaster. I kind of have a pessimistic view of what's going to happen. But still very, very unclear.
Can the UN mission there operate safely without the French-led peacekeeping force or French-led military force inside of Mali? Does this expose them, make it much more dangerous? They've suffered significant casualties.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of, if not the deadliest UN post. I would say it's definitely harder for them. I don't want to be like, clear cut on like, yes, this is going to be more difficult or this is going to be better. But I think I tend to lean more towards this will be more difficult. If you did have joint French and UN bases, you did have France providing support for a lot of MINUSMA. You did have French troops operating side by MINUSMA. With that gone now, I think this does open up MINUSMA for more attacks against it. They will be a prime, target of opportunity again. Unless something happens with Malian state and JNIM, the Al Qaeda group there in Mali. I really think that the UN might become a viable target for them again, depending on other things. So yes and no. Again, the whole theme of this is like so much is in the air right now that it's really hard to have a definitive answer of what's going to happen. But I don't think anyone really has a optimist view here. This is all kind of pessimistic at this point.
Yeah, the question here, becomes how does the Malian government deal with this vacuum? And there will be a vacuum. I mean, the French and allied troops have had a significant presence there. The question is now, do we think, is it possible that the Malian government goes into so-called peace talks or negotiations with the jihadists operating in central and northern Mali?
Yeah, I think there's like probably two scenarios I think that are probably most likely for what Mali does moving forward. And one of them is definitely the so-called peace talks or peace negotiations or whatever you want to call them. But I think we need to be clear here that, JNIM did state, I think maybe 2, maybe even 3 years ago at this point, that provided France does leave Mali, they would technically, quote unquote, negotiate with the Malian state. So we'll see how that turns out. However, also need to keep in mind of like, what does that actually mean? You've had instances in central Mali already where the Malian state has negotiated with JNIM for, allowing local access to certain towns or areas, or like allowing certain militias to maintain arms to protect their communities in return for giving JNIM essential control over those areas, enforcing Sharia, all that stuff. So to me, that's what I'm most worried about is, the Malian government does want to see this end. Do they take these peace talks in a way that basically just allows JNIM to consolidate its power? And I kind of lead more towards, yes, that's probably what will happen is you'll have more localized, if not a wider agreement that, might protect Mali in some degrees, but really you're allowing a consolidation of power by this Al Qaeda group to get what it wants, which is ultimately control and governance. It's their whole point of why they operate. And this is something that, the Malians themselves have to decide. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's certainly another option they could do, which there's been talk, of Russian mercenaries or PMCs, whatever you want to call them, especially the Wagner group, this nefarious Russian organization that kind of been all over Africa and elsewhere. I think the U.S. has finally confirmed that there are hundreds of Wagner forces in Mali already. When France left Timbuktu late last year, Wagner allegedly overtook or is now in command of the former French base in Timbuktu. I think reliance on Wagner to kind of do some of these former CT missions that France used to do is probably another likelihood that Mali, seeks to implement. Again, I don't agree with it, but let's look at this from Mali's perspective. If you had this French/Western military intervention for the past decade that, for all intents and purposes, really hasn't done what it said it was going to do, which is in the jihadist insurgency. In fact, it's basically metastasized the insurgency to a point where it really was, unsustainable for France. Well, they look at this, they look at, it's not working. We should probably try something else. Who else are they going to turn to? They can't turn to the U.S. because the U.S. supports Barkhane, basically the same, MO. But you have Russia, especially Wagner, offering a viable somewhat viable alternative. I say viable loosely because you look at what Wagner's done elsewhere in Africa. They're also in CAR, where they're basically just in it for mines. They were in Mozambique for a while, but lost a bunch of dudes. They were in Libya supporting Haftar, himself a war criminal. So like not a good group of dudes, but looking at this from a Mali perspective of they tried France for a while and it didn't work. So they're left with this, no good option of trying something new. And I think it's definitely between Wagner, the peace deals, or both. And that's what we're looking at moving forward.
Yeah, and I wonder, how does a government like Mali pay for Wagner? Is this something that's being funded by the Russians? We don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I have no idea.
In my mind, is that one where Russia will pay for it to gain influence?
I mean, that's kind of what they're doing in CAR. Not to go into too much detail of the conflict in the Central African Republic, or CAR, but there's a violent, civil war happening there, and Wagner, essentially the Russian state, is on the side of the government. But these Wagner mercenaries in CAR are essentially in it for controlling gold mines and other business deals. They kill civilians. They do all sorts of nasty things, all just to control these mines that inevitably fund the Russian state. So, who's to say what's going to happen in Mali? I mean, they do military operations in CAR and elsewhere, but I'm sure they would do the same in Mali. But the underlying thing here is they would probably find some nefarious way to pay themselves like they're doing elsewhere.
Yeah, it's just an interesting aspect of this. How does that? I get it in a country like CAR and some other countries. What does Mali have to offer the Russians? Unless it's just influence, it's a foothold into the region, which is the only thing I could come up with.
No, and I do want to caveat, I definitely do not agree with it, but you have to think of this from a Mali perspective. If you had this, foreign military intervention for the past decade and it didn't work, what would you, as the leader of Mali, where this has happened, would want to see? You would want to see results, right? So who else is promising some sort of result? Well, Russia.
Yeah, France has been signaling that it wants to end or draw down its mission in Africa for several years now. They've been very clear about that. Its commitment looks weak. The U.S. certainly isn't going to intervene. The UN can only do so much. The African Union has its hands filled in other countries. Again, I don't support the presence of Wagner in Mali or anywhere else in Africa, but they've had some success in areas where they've been deployed in Syria.
Certainly Libya. Yeah.
Yep. So, whether we agree with it or not, we can understand the rationale for the Malian government to pivot this way.
No, absolutely. Because not only does the Mali government, or any other government for that matter, look at, the failure of Barkhane, but they look at the success that Wagner has had. I mean, of course, it wasn't just Wagner that succeeded alone in Libya or Syria. They had other actors helping them. But, to a state like Mali, they see that as a success. They see that as a viable alternative. So going forward, I think that's something to watch, is how deeply involved does Wagner become, if at all, or do they expand rapidly in Mali? It's too soon to say, I think, but Wagner's definitely there, and they're there for the indefinite future, I would assume.
Caleb, and I'm not going to get too far afield here, just make a quick comment. The Western model of counterterrorism with limited boots on the ground, promoting local security forces, be they tribal militias or local or regional militias or state armies, all it really has done is extended these wars. It's led to stalemate or slow bleed losses. I think the Malian government has recognized this. I think a lot of countries have recognized this, and they're considering something else. In a way, I can't blame them.
No, and to be clear, there are certain structural and institutional problems that Mali faces that definitely exacerbates why this conflict happens in the first place, that France, or even the Western model in general, doesn't really address. It's a military first approach that thinks about these societal, institutional, structural things second. And not to say that that's Russia thinks about those either, but the Western model it's military first. So you're going to focus on these military operations before you do anything else. And that really doesn't do anything. That basically just, gets us to where we are now. If you have a military junta in Mali, that's not going to fix any of the structural problems. It's going to continue the path that was going down before, which just, again, exacerbates the overall conflict. So it's a huge, I guess, shitstorm, excuse my language, but that's where we're at.
Yes, indeed it is. I'm Bill Roggio, and this is Generation Jihad. Our guest today is Caleb Weiss. He's a senior analyst at Bridgeway Foundation and a contributor to the Long War Journal, and my good friend as well. Thanks again for joining us, Caleb. We're going to pivot to Benin now. Last week, jihadists executed 2 significant attacks in the country.
Yeah.
Tell us what exactly happened, and what does this mean for the future of Benin and the states surrounding it?
Yes. So I guess technically there was 3, depending on how you. Well, it depends on how you want to separate it. Because it was February 8th, I believe. Could be wrong on that exact date, but you had a complicated ambush and IED assault on park rangers and a French trainer in Benin's Park W, which is like this natural reserve that's sort of near the borders with Burkina Faso and Niger in the country's northeast. But shortly after, there was another IED on basically a Beninese military patrol that was coming to reinforce the troops in contact, essentially. So there was 2, and then 2 days later, you had another IED in the same park against park rangers. So technically 3, but 2 of them happened relatively close to each other on the same day, based around the same event. But regardless of that, you've had 9 people die last week from these 3 attacks, which is, it sucks, 9 people dead, but that's pretty large for Benin, where the brewing insurgency there has been relatively small. IEDs have only been occurring since, I think late December, which really, that's a huge escalation from, just jihadists using Benin as like a rear base or like a logistical hub or like somewhere to transit through to other countries. They're now actively targeting this country. And not only they're targeting Benin, but they're targeting with IEDs, which when the insurgency in Burkina Faso first started, I believe in like 2016, early 2017, you didn't see IEDs at first. Like you saw normal assaults, you saw normal ambushes, and then you started seeing IEDs. And then once the first IED started happening, you started huge deterioration in the country's security. And I don't want to be super alarmist saying that that's exactly what we're going to see in Benin, but the fact that we were having IEDs and we've had 3 IEDs last week, it's a huge escalation to me, and does not bode well for the safety of that country. And I've been keeping tabs on, jihadist linked attacks, and most of these are JNIM, if not all of them, JNIM AQ's, group in the Sahel. But really since 2016, which that was March 2016, when JNIM's predecessor group, AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, did a terrorist attack on a beach resort in Ivory Coast. That was the first attack AQ ever did in coastal West Africa. And since then, there's been 30 attacks in these littoral states, most of them situated along Ivory Coast and Benin. But most of these 30 have happened within the last year. So this isn't something that it's been there, kind of residual. But it wasn't until last year that it started a huge escalation. It's only got getting worse at this point. I would say most of these attacks are kind of situated along, natural reserves in both Ivory Coast and Benin, which, makes sense if you're an insurgent. You're going to use these natural reserves as your logistical rear bases anyway. But now they're actively attacking, and especially as violence pushes out of Burkina Faso, which is kind of the nucleus of JNIM, along with Central Mali at this point. If you have JNIM and ISGS to a degree, the Islamic State branch in West Africa, or I guess the Sahel, but they're pushing south from Burkina Faso into their respective areas of Ivory Coast and Benin, and to a lesser extent Togo. Togo has had one attack. I think that was last November. And then there's been a few attacks in Burkina Faso close to the Ghana border. Ghana's been a little bit more secretive with what's happening. There's been recruitment in Ghana. There was a Ghanaian suicide bomber, JNIM, I believe, last year as well. So like, not operational yet in Ghana, at least to open source reporting, but they're definitely there. So this is a huge worry that kind of goes into France's decision to reposition across West Africa. Of like, yeah, we'll leave Mali, but there's all these sort of other problems that we have to deal with now. And one of them is this big jihadist push across littoral West Africa, which, depending on if they are successful in opening up these insurgencies in these respective countries, that's a huge escalation from a small insurgency that started in northern Mali. Now you're having an insurgency that literally started in the sands of northern Mali down to the coastline of Ivory Coast. And this is a huge problem that I think deserves more attention. It's getting a little more attention now, but as we see this escalate, it's going to be a lot worse for France and its European and even American partners to deal with. I don't really have any optimistic hopes that they will be able to stymie this. I think a lot of the structural problems that go into what's happening in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger that allowing insurgencies to brew there, some of that is happening in these countries as well. I mean, you do have communal conflict in northern Benin and residual conflict in Ivory Coast, some in Togo, that jihadists can exploit. They can work with these marginalized communities, especially the Fulani. The Fulani are this large ethnic group across West Africa that forms basically the crux of some of JNIM's main or most active subgroups. So if they're able to capitalize on some of those grievances or other grievances with the local governments, you're going to see a lot more recruitment. You're going to see a lot more, I guess, mobilization of people for the jihadist cause. And to be clear, just to throw this out there, Benin does have some problems with bandits, with other criminal organizations in these same parks. So it's important to note that not only are they facing a jihadist threat now, but they have had problems with bandits in the past that, as the jihadists, operate more in those areas, probably get a little more blurry to distinguish between who's actually doing the attacks, which will make it harder for people like me to keep track of. But it's important to note that they do have those residual problems still, sort of like northwestern Nigeria, which northwestern Nigeria is a little out of the scope of this conversation. I don't want to get us bogged down with what's happening there, but long story short, there's a huge bandit problem in northwest Nigeria, but the bandits are somewhat nominally affiliated with jihadists and vice versa, and it's a whole mess.
Yeah, Caleb, you identified, you noted the use of ID, the introduction of the IED, or the improvised explosive device. It certainly is a signal to the next level, or the possible next level of uncertainty. We'll certainly see how this develops in Benin. But I can say with certainty, I remember when we started seeing the IEDs going off in Iraq, and then we started to see the IEDs go off in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. We started then, it switched over. We started to see a suicide attack, and then they just started coming on. The escalation in tactics is something certainly that tells us that there's a growing insurgency. And as you identified, these areas, they went from rear areas or logistic hub and support hubs. And when they start going into active insurgency, that means there's a lot of things that happen in the background that we don't fully understand.
No, and I think that's an important point, just to hit on it real quick, is like, to build these support bases, to build these rear bases, they already had to have some sort of social communal contract with the locals to allow that to happen. So there's already something, political or whatever you want to call it, working behind the scenes that have allowed these groups to be there in the first place, which is way more difficult to, extinguish than anything militarily alone. So yeah, it's just a huge escalation that, these groups probably been working on for years to allow this to happen. Yeah. And now we're seeing the fruit of it.
The decision to flip that switch from support or rear area, however you want to define that, to an active insurgency, that's significant. It's a great risk that they're taking, and it's one that a decision they don't make lightly. So I think it tells us to a degree that they have confidence that they believe now is the time to escalate that conflict. Whether they're making the right calculation or not, we don't know. But we're certainly going to find out, right?
We'll certainly see what happens. Yeah, and I don't have a good feeling about it, unfortunately.
No, and I wish we could put a map up as we're talking about this. One day we'll get over to video and do that. But the area that Caleb's discussing here in West Africa, literal Africa, it's weak borders, relatively weak states with security holes. This is where, when you get, if we do get a security vacuum in Mali, it doesn't just go, well, we could just shore up the borders in the surrounding countries and things will be fine. These borders are fluid. The jihadists know how to transit these borders. They have relationship with criminal groups and bandits, as you had mentioned. And it really, they have an advantage, particularly in an area like this. I used to always think that nobody could pick out like Waziristan, in North and South Waziristan, or Pakistan's tribal areas, that it was like, the heart of darkness. But we're talking about it, Waziristan is like cosmopolitan United States compared to the areas that Caleb is covering here.
To an extent, yeah. Like, they're definitely wild, like I would assume the tribals of Pakistan are, but it's certainly a viable area for them to operate in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's turn to our last topic here, Somalia and Shabab. That Shabab is Al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa, and they're especially strong in Somalia as well as in northern Kenya. They've been quite active over the past several months, years, days, weeks. Shabab is quite active. Several years ago, a U.S. general said that the U.S. commander of AFRICOM, or U.S. Africa Command, said that 25% of Somalia was under Shabab control. Now,
much higher. It's so much higher.
Caleb's giving me the thumbs up. That was several years ago. That's military's best case estimate. One of the things I'll always say here is, when military gives you a number on something that isn't flattering, you can guarantee that you could increase that percentage. That was 2+ years ago.
That was, and like,
and things haven't improved.
This is a small point that we don't have to discuss that much, but I mean, just think about it, of the amount of territory that they are controlling or influencing, directly controlling or influencing, is substantial. I mean, it's a significant portion of rural southern Somalia, a lot of central Somalia. This is an area. It's way more than 25%.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that requires thousands of people. So I also want to say that, like, not only are like the estimates for their overall areas that they control or influence low, I would say that the troop estimate that you see a lot, that's 7,000 to 12,000, is also insanely low.
Caleb, if I dare I go to Afghanistan, two things that drove me crazy: the estimate of the number of Taliban fighters, because one of the things that I mapped the Taliban's control of districts. That number always had to be far more than what was given, and the dismissal of the control of rural areas. Guess what, folks? The Taliban took control of Afghanistan because they had a lot more troops than we estimated.
I don't want to call them Maoists, but I mean, that's typical, Maoist strategy, right? It's the people's war. You start in the rural areas and you work your way to the urban.
Yeah, and this is, we're seeing a very similar dynamic. I don't think it's an accident. It plays to the strengths of Shabab, and Shabab is now taking has been taking these attacks to the heart of Somalia, or to the capital of Mogadishu. Caleb, there's several attacks last week. You did have an excellent write-up about this at the Long War Journal. Talk about this. What's the significance of these attacks? What's happening here?
Yeah, so it was actually just a couple of days ago, if not yesterday. The dates are a little blurry for me. Sorry.
Oh my God! Yes, you're right. It was
in the land of
published that. Yeah.
In the era of COVID, time. First of all, time is a social construct. Time is completely made up, and especially in COVID, time means nothing anymore.
Yes.
So anyway, but yeah, huge attack in Mogadishu. Essentially, what happened is they literally attacked 5 different areas of Mogadishu and its like surrounding suburbs, which that's huge news anywhere else, but kind of didn't get a lot of headlines for some reason. But regardless of that, they attacked 5 distinct areas of Mogadishu with 2 suicide bombings and like huge military assaults. So they attacked 3 areas, 2 of which with suicide car bombs, and then a normal assault. They attacked two areas with suicide car bombs and a normal military assault. 3 other areas were attacked to basically prevent reinforcements to going to the bigger attacks. So they targeted military and police troops in these 3 other areas to basically cut them off or keep them busy focusing on them rather than the larger attacks. But what they were doing is they were targeting military, government troops, being the Somali National Army, as well as government officials. They actually attacked a government official's personal residence. But what they're doing, or why they did this, they made it very clear in their claim of responsibility, is this is directly related to the ongoing, parliamentary elections going on in Mogadishu, as well as the upcoming presidential election next week. And they're basically saying that, how could you have these elections if you can't even secure your capital? And that's almost verbatim of what they said. Of, we did this to show that you are, you're unsecure, you're unstable. How can the people trust you? And I think to a point, to an extent, they have a point there. You have thousands of troops in Mogadishu. You have, international community, international, agencies all focused on Mogadishu. And this group is still able to target highly fortified areas across the capital, even during this period when international community is insanely focused on Mogadishu for these elections. To me, that says a lot about not only Shabab's capabilities, but, the struggle of securing Mogadishu. Again, this is a place where the international community has been for 30 years now, and it's still insanely insecure. The federal government has basically reduced the clanism, and then you have Shabab taking advantage of all of this.
Yeah, and Shabab is able to pull off attacks like this because it has a significant presence in Mogadishu, but it's also using its control of the suburban or influence and control, or
right. I do want to be careful with that distinction of what do we mean with control?
Sure.
I don't really know. There are definitely areas of southern Somalia and central Somalia where they do outright control. Right. Like their flag is flying, they're enforcing Sharia, but there's a lot of areas where they just have heavy influence, where they may not be physically present, but the local clan, whoever pledges bayah to Shabab, and therefore that's their local representative. But when we say control, that's what I mean. It encompasses both. I don't want to be just assuming they outright control all of these areas, because they don't. But they do heavily influence way more than 25%, just to have another knock at that little percentage.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, believe me, no one knows more about the issue of control. That was the hardest thing to do on the Afghanistan map, where you knew Shabab, the Taliban all but flew the flag, but they were collecting the taxes. They were taking the pay from the teachers. They were dictating what goes in the schools. They're running judges.
It's kind of the same.
The soft control or influence, however you want to define that. But it's just as important as that fly the flag. And I would actually argue that that's much more subtle and gives them much more room to operate.
No, I would assume it gives them more legitimacy too, because when you're not outright controlling, you're allowing the local clans, which I'm assuming this is what the Taliban also did. Shabab looks at Taliban as a viable model, but when you have these areas of influence, what Shabab does is they legitimize, they weaponize, they basically uphold the local clan as their representatives. They give the local clan whatever they need, money, support, whatever, and then the local clan is basically their government. They provide taxes, or they give taxes back to Shabab in return for Shabab allows them some autonomy, or they don't attack in certain areas or stuff like that. It's basically playing a game of, the clanism of Somalia that the federal government still can't figure out, or not willing to go as far as what Shabab does.
Yeah, I think that more than overt control delegitimizes the federal government, because the federal government will pretend that these areas are areas that it controls, but everyone really knows the score. And one last thing, you mentioned the lack of coverage of these attacks. I was thinking about that as we were having this conversation. I mean, yeah, that is big news. And I do think the news in Africa definitely gets buried unless there's a Western angle on it, for instance. Literally that is the story of most African conflicts. Right. If it doesn't include a white person dying, it usually doesn't get. Yeah. Or a white person saying we're going to withdraw troops.
Yeah. Right? And that's the sad thing. Like, you have hundreds of thousands, well, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds or thousands of people dying in these conflicts that, hardly get any Western coverage, because there isn't a white person involved or some sort of Western involvement. And that's super, it's messed up, first of all.
Caleb, you mentioned that. I remember seeing, I want to say, and I'll apologize if I'm wrong, But I remember with the as the prison attack was going on in Syria, I think it was Human Rights Watch, and if I'm wrong about this, I'll apologize right here. But issues a statement about the state of prisons and this and that, and the only people mentioned are there's Americans there, there's Canadians there, there's Brits there, there's
that
like,
it was
really so only Americans, Brits, not the Iraqi prisoners, not the Syrian prisoners, or any other prisoners.
That was an HRW person, and to be clear, HRW has done good work in Africa. Yeah. But that was quite the take, man. Of like you're completely just weaving out all the local prisoners that are also suffering just as bad as the Westerners,
and who probably to several degrees of magnitude are represented in those populations. And look, Caleb and I are not sympathizing for the hardcore jihadists who fought for the Islamic State. We recognize
but don't reduce the agency of the locals, man.
Yeah. There's people who have been caught up here. There's children. There's some people who were misled into going there because they didn't understand. These are situations that need to be dealt with. But yeah, exactly. Well, I think Caleb we'll let it go there. You got anything else for us on Africa?
I think it's important to note. This kind of ties into the lack of coverage overall of especially Shabab. Shabab doesn't really generate the headlines it used to for whatever reason. But, I've calculated or kept tabs on this for the past 3 years of Shabab's suicide operations. And really since January 1st, 2020, they've conducted 62 suicide bombings in that time frame. That is a huge amount of suicide bombings that anywhere else in the world would probably get a lot of coverage on. But it doesn't for some reason.
Caleb, that's fascinating. I'm trying to think right now. Where have there been in the last year been more suicide attacks? Afghanistan ended in mid-August. We haven't seen many there. A couple by the Islamic State. I'm not seeing that level of activity in Iraq or Syria. I don't, that's a significant statistic. Shabab has been underestimated as a threat to both the Somali government and the international community. And the lack of coverage on this is shocking. I do understand there's a lot going in the world, Russia, Ukraine, with some crazy headlines and predictions that don't come through. The press does, and let's face it, the press is going to ignore Africa, like you said, unless there's a Western angle to it.
No, and that's the unfortunate truth. And it makes it really difficult to get people to care about Africa. This has kind of been an uphill battle for me, especially of people ask me of like, why should we care or what can we do? Well, I'm not going to say that we can or should do anything, but you should absolutely care that people are dying like that. First of all, dying from these jihadist insurgencies. Second of all, it suggests that like it shouldn't receive the same amount of attention as like a conflict in Europe is absurd to me.
Yeah, absolutely. What happens when the next suicide bomber in, France comes from Benin or Côte d'Ivoire, right? Like what happens in those cases? Is that what's going to take for people to wake up to the threat?
Right. And we say this all the time is like, people are not going to care until they have to. And this is the unfortunate truth here now. So, let's see what happens. France has had, kind of the same discussions that, we had here in America about our presence in Afghanistan. A lot of that was happening in France where people just wanted out, or people just, they stopped caring. They don't want to be there anymore. Well, they're not going to care until they have to care again.
Yeah. It's no way to fight this kind of war. It's unfortunate. I chalk all this up though to a lack of leadership and a lack of understanding of what got us into this war to begin with, which was ignoring these threats. Right. And then what got us to this point now is that people, they didn't see an insta solution. I always, I don't know if it's a joke, but I always say it. They want McWar. They wanted to pull through the drive-through. Yeah, get the war in a package.
Literally generational conflicts, man. This is why it's called Generation Jihad, man. You have what's the famous quote from Zalahi? I'm sure Zalahi is paraphrasing from someone else, but you think the West thinks in terms of elections. We think in terms of generations.
Yes,
and that's exactly what's happening.
That's exactly it. On that upbeat note, Caleb, we will call it a
That's
day.
It.
I hope to have you on soon. We will definitely get you back.
Sorry for depressing everyone.
Listen, Generation Jihad, I think, should come with a mandatory
therapy session. Yeah,
therapy and possibly medication, anti-suicide We should actually publish a suicide hotline number in conjunction with this video, with this audio, this podcast.
It's not fun topics, man. It's all depressing of like, and it does get to you. Like, this is not a weird tangent that I'm going to go on.
No, go for it.
But like reading and researching and talking about basically the worst of humanity, right? Like these people, like jihadists, are not good people. Like they torture people, they maim people, they blow each other up. That does get to you mentally, and I do want to stress that for potentially other analysts or other researchers of maybe going through the same thing of like it absolutely does affect your mental health. I can't tell you how many times it's just sitting here randomly in the day and just like an image from like a jihadist video I've seen just pops up and it's instantly disturbing. And I think we do as people in this field dealing with extremism and violence and everything, we probably need to take mental health more seriously. I know I'm going on a weird tangent. No, this is something that needs to be said, and I think doesn't get enough recognition. So hopefully we as a field start to realize that of, secondhand PTSD or like this vicarious trauma is real. Like it absolutely is real. Yeah. We should take it more seriously.
I could not agree. We are human beings, Caleb. We're not robots who just process this information. I mean, I'll admit it. After Afghanistan collapsed and I was busy helping people get out of country, both Afghans and American citizens and anyone else who needed to get out. But once that sort of started to taper down, I'm still working on efforts with that. Boy, I called it a Afghanistan hangover. I want to say it was somewhere around the Christmas holiday. And I had to do everything I could to pick myself up, go skiing, get outside, go hiking, something, anything, and step away from it a little bit to realize I've just been in this a little too far, but doing this a long, long time. I liken our work to being a homicide detective. It's horrible work, but it's fascinating at the same time. It's interesting. We're trying to get into the mind of killers.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm purely here by choice. Like, I'm definitely here because I'm fascinated by these people, but it does take a toll mentally for sure.
But right. And I can't imagine the things that homicide detectives see and the type of people they deal with. It's got to be a lot like that. And now, that being said, I'm not on the front lines. I'm not carrying a gun. I'm not in it all the time.
No, and like that plays into it too, man. Like kind of have this like guilt of like, should I, as this researcher who's viewing this from thousands of miles away, even feel this way? But I think that, that's kind of, again, pardon my language, but kind of a bullshit thinking, man. Like you are also being affected by this. Like it's okay to feel that, the secondhand trauma. And and that's part of being human. You are being empathetic to these other humans that are suffering firsthand. That is a normal response of seeing this happen. You're feeling for those other people. It's okay to also feel bad, and that also needs to be said.
When I was doing embeds with the U.S. military in Iraq and once in Afghanistan, but multiple times in Iraq, that sort of gave me a little bit of that. I'm out there, I'm experiencing, I'm sharing the pain in what little way. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't a soldier there. That was a decade prior to that. But and there's that. And, you mentioned, one of the things that always bothers me, I realized we kind of went off on a tangent here.
That's fine. All of this needs to be said. Like I have no regrets.
I'm often accused of hating Pakistan, being a Pakistan hater, right? And because of my reporting on the Pakistani state's support for jihadist groups, right? And meanwhile, I'm the one pointing out that the Pakistani state is directly responsible by playing its double game of supporting the Taliban, which supports the Pakistani Taliban, which kills Pakistani soldiers and policemen and civilians. And then the Pakistani state still goes back and supports the Afghan Taliban, this wheel of jihad. And like, I care about those people, and watching them needlessly die because their own government is so callous. Those things, it gets to you. And, we get called, I get called pro-war. I get called, but man, it was up to me. I'd love this to be my last episode of Generation Jihad, and I'll go figure out a new career. I wish we could win this one. These weren't a problem. I think I'm enterprising enough that I can go ahead and, at my age, figure something else out. But the reality is it's still here. And it's because our leadership is bad. Our That's civilian, military, intelligence. And we're in these situations because our leadership doesn't want to recognize that what we are in is indeed a generational war, as you noted.
No. So on that happy note,
let's call it a day. Yeah. Caleb, thank you so much. I'm really glad we went there. Probably was worth its own podcast.
Yeah, I kind of want to do like a whole podcast on like the mental health of the mental health problems. I don't know how to call it, but of this field, and like the vicarious trauma. And maybe we could have like, just more than just you and me. Maybe we could have other people from the field talk about their own struggles, but this needs more recognition in the field. I think there was an article maybe a year or two ago about this, but other than that, there really hasn't been much about like the extremism, terrorism research field facing these mental problems that it does need to be out there.
What we have to watch, what we have to experience in order for us to put this podcast together, for us to write the articles that we write, is the stuff that we leave on the floor, right? That we don't publish because, frankly, it's too horrific for us to reproduce, and we don't want everyone to see that. It's
no, and like I mentioned, there's that like feeling of guilt of like, should I, as someone who lives, in Boston, for instance, have this feeling of PTSD or trauma, even though like what actually happened thousands of miles away in Africa? But no, you're a human. You're feeling empathetic for those people. It's fine. Yeah. You are allowed to feel that way.
We are human beings. We are not robots. Caleb, thank you again for joining us. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive review if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.